Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're talking all about new addition Shake Milton and second-year Timberwolves Kyle Anderson. What will each of their roles be? What is Shake Milton bringing to the table? Why the Wolves signed him? What his role will be this season? And also, how will Kyle Anderson's role change? What will Slow-Mo have to do differently this year than he did in his first year in a Wolves uniform? It's all upcoming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy hump day. Happy eve of the first Timberwolves preseason game coming up on Thursday from Abu Dhabi. A big thank you, first of all, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Of course, now is a great time. The Twins in opening up with a win in the Wild Card Series, the first playoff game win for the Twins in 18 years. They haven't won a series in 19 years, 18 tries over 19 years, 18 games over 19 years. And if they win on either Wednesday or Thursday, they'll win their first series since 2002. So 21 years ago, believe it or not. Anyway, now's a great time to subscribe to the Locked On Sports Minnesota channel. Of course, football season as well. And you can do that, again, on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Beecken and at Locked On T-Wolves. Don't forget the T. All right. I want to start by talking Shake Milton today. He is one of the, I don't know, I guess in general, the Timberwolves additions this offseason have not been not nearly as quite literally large as, say, Rudy Gobert last offseason. And a lot of what the Wolves are banking on this year is health from Karl-Anthony Towns, improvement from Rudy Gobert based, from his first year in Minnesota, which by all accounts for him individually was disappointing. And then also Anthony Edwards taking the leap from star to superstar. That's where the Wolves are going to improve the most. But their depth is also unquestionably better now than it was 12 months ago. And we've talked already about Troy Brown Jr. That was on Tuesday's show. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, of course, came over at the trade deadline, but the Wolves will have a full season of him for the first time. And Shake Milton is the other addition from outside the organization that we have to talk about. And I want to spend most of our time, or about half our time today, I guess, talking about Shake Milton and why that signing was so important. What is his role going to be? Well, he is effectively the backup point guard, and I don't think he's a natural point guard necessarily. Chris Finch has come out and said recently, it was towards the end of the offseason, he gave an interview, or he was on a podcast and said, hey, Shake Milton we consider him a point guard. He is a point guard. Now, he was nominally a backup point guard with the Sixers, but obviously playing with some of the other guys they had there that initiate offense, namely James Harden. He wasn't initiating a ton of offense for them, but he could off the bench, right? He's really that versatile combo guard type player. He's almost got the size more of a shooting guard or a big point guard, but he's a scorer, right? Like he can get his head and shoulders past you, get to the basket and score. We saw him do that to the Wolves. He had 20 plus in one of the games against the Wolves last year for the Sixers when they were shorthanded, and was really impressive. So he is a score first type of guard. And I think maybe the best way to put this in a Wolves context for fans who watched this team last year is he's a much more experienced and much better shooting version of Jalen Noel. He's nearly as bad defensively. I would argue Shake Milton's not quite as bad. I mean, Jalen Noel is one of the worst perimeter defenders in the league last season and has been over his career. Again, hate to just rag on Jalen Noel, but there's a reason he's not on a roster right now. Shake Milton's better than that, but he's not a good defender, right? Where he's better than Noel, beyond the experience thing, he's been in the playoffs 4 or 5 seasons. He's just a better shooter, and he's a more consistent offensive player. You're not going to get the ups and downs. Jalen Noel at times was a bucket, and that was the thing that was said about him a bunch. It was true. He could get a shot off whenever he wanted, and when he was on, he was really on. But there were a lot of lows to the Jalen Noel experience, especially last season. Shake Milton, is much more consistent. Much, much more consistent overall as a player, and certainly on the offensive end of the floor. And to me, that's what the Wolves were searching for in this role. Last year, they went into the season assuming the Wolves did. Jordan McLaughlin was the backup point guard, right? Jaylen Nowell was the backup too. His minutes are going to be limited because he's going to play behind Ant. But then McLaughlin gets hurt around the same time as Karl-Anthony Towns did, in the late November timeframe. And instead of finding a backup point guard I guess that would have been the only other option. There was no other backup point guard on the roster. The Timberwolves opted to just have Jaylen Nowell essentially run the second unit offense, except for when Ant would be subbed back in. But you'd get 4 to 8 to 10 minutes per game where Jaylen Nowell was effectively running the offense with the bench unit. And as the season wore on, Finch kind of started to hand those keys to Kyle Anderson and was like, hey, Slow-Mo, go play a point forward. We trust you to get us into our offense. It's going to be more consistent than just giving the ball to Nowell, because what does Nowell want to do? He wants to shoot. And as the year wore on, I think I was certainly expecting him to at some point look more like the version of the Jaylen Nowell from 21-22, when he was legitimately great off the bench for the Wolves and was really good in the playoffs in that series against Memphis. That never happened. And so the Wolves were left with this, and then McLaughlin eventually comes back from injury, was not himself either. So the backups in the backcourt for the Wolves, like, thank goodness they got Nickeil Alexander-Walker, as at the time I was wrong. I thought it was more of a throw-in. He was a huge piece of that trade when they brought Mike Conley in, because otherwise, who are your backups in the backcourt? It's Austin Rivers. Like, he's the only other guy. Bryn Forbes is off the team midseason. Wasn't good when he was with the team. That was kind of it, right? Like, there was nobody else with any consistency in the backcourt, especially after McLaughlin got hurt, and Jaylen Nowell was not it. Shake Milton's here to provide that veteran leadership off the bench, some consistency, and just better shooting all the way around. And this is part of, I did a show back in, I think, late July, early August, comparing what the Wolves brought in with Shake Milton and Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, lumping him in, even though he was a trade deadline acquisition. They re-signed him this offseason, compared to what's out. And that's Taurean Prince, it's Jaylen Nowell, and in terms of the rotation, I believe it's Jordan McLaughlin. And I brought back a little bit of that on Tuesday's show in talking about Brown Jr. and Alexander-Walker. And I want to talk a little bit more about that today, because while those two are essentially cobbled, their minutes will be cobbled together to cover over what Taurean Prince, what went out the door with TP leaving. Jordan McLaughlin and Jaylen Nowell's minutes will mostly be covered by Shake Milton. And of course, we're talking 3 for 3. It's not perfect, but this is the comparison for me, because Shake is the backup point guard. That was Jordan McLaughlin's role, but he's also a combo guard. He's effectively a backup 2 guard as well for the Wolves. You look at the rest of the bench, there aren't any other guards that are like true guards, like point guards or shooting guards, that you would say these guys are in the rotation, right? Your 5-man bench unit, it's Shake, it's Naz Reid, and then it's 3 wings in the middle in Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Troy Brown Jr., and Kyle Anderson. Yes, technically Troy Brown's going to probably play some shooting guard. Nickeil Alexander-Walker will play some shooting guard, but those guys are wings. They're pretty interchangeable. Shake is the only one that really is. And I know we'll actually might as well talk about it now. Alexander-Walker is going to initiate some offense, which is why I've hesitated to call Shake Milton the backup point guard. I mean, Chris Finch basically did say that, but Alexander-Walker is going to get his turn to initiate offense. But Shake is the one who's going to get those backup minutes behind both Mike Conley and Anthony Edwards. And that, in my mind, is the Jaylen Nowell role. And then also the Jordan McLaughlin role from the start of the season last year. Shake Milton is a better 3-point shooter than both of those guys. He's actually a better rebounder than both of those guys. He's not a worse defender than Jaylen Nowell, as we've talked about. And he's also an equal playmaker in my mind as well. So I want to get to all that next. I want to talk about what he brings to the table in general, what the role will be. And then we'll shift into talking about Slow-Mo and how Kyle Anderson's role will definitely change this season, just based on the rest of the makeup of the rest of this roster. So we'll get to all of that here next. It's football season. That means pizza, wings, and maybe even some buffalo chicken dip. Whatever you prefer at your tailgate or your watch party, go all out and get cash back on every single purchase with our friends at Ibotta. Ibotta gives you cash back on hundreds of grocery items, from produce to personal care to pantry goods, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. Either link your loyalty account or upload your receipt after you shop and get your cash back. It really is that easy. The average Ibotta user earns $100 per year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, or you could use your cash back to buy that flight you've been eyeing, that game you've been dying to go to, or the fancy dinner you've been craving. Other apps give you points that don't amount to much, but with Ibotta, you get real cash back that you can cash out to your bank account, PayPal, or gift cards. You can earn cash back on hundreds of online brands and retailers too when you start with Ibotta, including Lowe's, Macy's, Sephora, Best Buy, and more. Download the Ibotta app now and use the code LOCKED to start earning real cash back. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app. Use the code LOCKED. That's Ibotta, Ibotta, in the Google Play or App Store, and use the code LOCKED. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, everydayers, we'll talk on Thursday. We've got Mavs, Wolves from Abu Dhabi. We'll talk a little bit about that, what to look out for. We'll also continue the player preview series on Thursday. We'll pause on Friday to do a post-game pod based on what happens in Abu Dhabi Thursday. So that'll be what we do Friday. We might do one player preview depending on how much there is to really glean from preseason game number one. The Wolves play again Saturday. So we'll start next week with a bit of a post-game pod of sorts on Monday's show, and then we'll get right back into player previews and finish that out next week. And then we're into the teeth of the preseason and just a couple of weeks out from actual regular season basketball. So plenty to get to here in the coming days and weeks. Make sure you're following and subscribed wherever you listen to podcasts. All right. Continuing the Shake Milton conversation, I alluded to this just a moment ago, but he is a better shooter, certainly than Jordan McLaughlin, and absolutely better than what Jaylen Nowell provided for the Wolves last year. Jaylen Nowell, after shooting the ball well a couple of seasons ago, was under 30% from three. Jordan McLaughlin has gotten worse every year from outside the arc. Last season was basically 31%, 30.8%. So you're talking Jordan McLaughlin, 31%. We're rounding up as a three-point shooter. It gotten worse each of his years in the league over the course of 3 seasons. Jaylen Nowell, 28.9%, will round up to 29%. So you're replacing a 31% three-point shooter and a 29% three-point shooter who combined to average 4.5 shot attempts per game from outside the arc. So you're taking, 5.5. So you're taking Nowell and McLaughlin, 5.5 three-pointers per game, about 30%. And you're replacing that with whatever Shake's going to end up shooting. And with, at least with Philly the last couple of years, he was attempting a little over 2 3-pointers per game. Over the course of his career, 2.5 3-pointers per game. Last year, about 2 per game. He's going to get more than 2 per game with this Wolves team. I think he's going to have pretty heavy bench minutes, and he's going to have more opportunities to shoot. Now, last year, he was 38% from 3, rounding up from 37.8. For his career, he's 36.5%. So really right about where league average has been the last couple of years. He's got one 43% season in there. He's got a couple that were around 32% that seem to be outliers. Again, career average 36.5%. No matter how you slice it and dice it, he's a better option as a perimeter shooter than both Jordan McLaughlin and Jaylen Nowell. Overall, B-Ball Index, who we cite often because they do a fantastic job of compiling different advanced stats. They have their own. It's all in a great spot, bball-index.com. They gave him a B as a overall perimeter scorer. Above the break threes last season, Shake Milton shot 42%, 41.9% on above the break threes. That's in the 92nd percentile league-wide, grades out as an A, which is really interesting. And also, by the way, 72% of his three-point attempts came from above the break. Not as good in the corners, which is weird. Actually, just 30% in the corners. But he was super, 42% above the break, and also 40% on catch-and-shoot threes, which is a 76th percentile league-wide, and that grades out as a B+, according to B-Ball Index. That is quite literally, literally isn't the right word. It is, I'll say it anyway. It is literally night and day from Jaylen Nowell and Jordan McLaughlin, 29, 30%, to Shake Milton shooting, 36, 37%, but 40% catch and shoot, 42% above the break. And again, bringing Taurean Prince back into the conversation, you have to find a way to replace his shooting. And you could do that with Shake Milton, 40% catch and shoot, with Troy Brown Jr., 39% catch and shoot. Prince was 41% catch and shoot. Combined, Milton and Brown are going to probably shoot more threes per game than Taurean Prince did last year at roughly the same efficiency, assuming that carries forward. So unless something crazy happens, you're going to replace a lot of that shooting. Yeah, it comes in the form of 2 different guys, plus whatever Nickeil Alexander-Walker can give you. But no matter how you shake it, no matter how Shake Milton, we'll say it this way. No matter how it shakes out, or at the end of the day, whatever phrase you want to use, Troy Brown, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Shake Milton are better than Jaylen Nowell and I don't know, Austin Rivers. Better. It's Taurean Prince in a vacuum, you could argue, is still the better player of all these guys at this exact moment. Never mind the fact that he is aging a bit. He would have cost more than all of them. He's probably the best player in a vacuum. But if Prince, Noel, and Jordan McLaughlin, Austin Rivers are out of the rotation, and you're adding in Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Shake Milton, and Troy Brown Jr., that's an improvement. You're raising the floor. You're raising, raising a raise. What am I trying to say? A raising tide lifts all ships. Is that the phrase? Is that what I'm trying to say? That's true here. This roster depth is much, much, much improved over last season. And this is one really good example of it. And I keyed in on the shooting for Shake. We could also talk about playmaking as well. Again, I don't think he's a pure point guard, but will be asked to initiate offense along with Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And as I've said all along, I think Anthony Edwards will also initiate some second unit offense. There will be those same chunks of minutes each game, anywhere from 4 to 10 minutes, depending on the night, where Ant's not on the floor and somebody else has to initiate. Ant and Mike Conley are both not on the floor and somebody's got to initiate. Shake Milton and Nickeil Alexander-Walker are the first two up to do that in an ideal world. B-Ball Index gave Shake Milton a B in playmaking last season. He was a solid playmaker for the 76ers. He 84th percentile, grades out as an A- in terms of assist points per 75 offensive possessions on the court, which is a good way of measuring the value of the assist that he was getting. Passing creation volume was a B+, 75th percentile. High value assists per 75 possessions, which is assists that led to 3-point attempts or free throws. He had an A- last season, 87th percentile. So that speaks to Shake's ability as a playmaker, as a decision maker, knowing where, and the Sixers are obviously a well-run team and an incredible offensive team. Shake Milton fit right in there because he knew the right pass to make. And he's going from Joel Embiid and James Harden and those guys there to coming to play with Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. And I'm not at all suggesting, like, clearly the Sixers have a it's a bit of a different level, right? But it's the same idea. And Shake knows how to play with superstars. He knows how to fit in. He knows how to pick his spots, as we saw him do against the Wolves. Like when some of those guys are down, he's got to create more for himself. He can do that, but he's also a better catch and shoot guy than the guys he's replacing. He's a better playmaker than Jalen Noel. He's a better playmaker than Austin Rivers. Better playmaker than Taurean Prince. Now, McLaughlin, fine, we can have that conversation, but he's also still on the roster. Like McLaughlin's still your break glass in case of emergency because there's foul trouble or we just need somebody to run the offense. Jordan McLaughlin can still do that. There's still a chance he fights for some minutes this year. We talked about him the other day on the show. But in general, Shake Milton replacing the Noel McLaughlin Rivers minutes is a clear win for the Timberwolves. All right, let's segue into talking about Kyle Anderson and what his role is going to be this year. Slow-Mo had a career year last year shooting the basketball by almost any metric, three-point shooting easily the best of his career, 41%. Previously, his career best shooting the three was way back in 2016-17 when he shot 37.5% with the Spurs. And prior to last season, he was a career 33.4% three-point shooter. But last year, he shot it at the third greatest volume in his career, and he shot it by far best efficiency, 41%. He was really good from the corners. Teams are still leaving him open, though, because we know Kyle Anderson is not a sharpshooter. That's probably going to come back to earth a little bit. But effective field goal percentage for him was the best of his career, led in large part because of the three-point percentage. But even just raw field goal percentage, which I don't like to use, it was his third best overall field goal percentage of his career. Part of it is he was playing the four a little bit more. He was involved in some more pick and roll. He got some easy buckets that way. But his overall usage wasn't extremely high, as it shouldn't be, but he started a lot more games than he had over, at least his last year in Memphis because of the injury to Karl-Anthony Towns. He found himself in the starting lineup 46 times last season. I think Anderson is a candidate for some regression this year from a raw numbers standpoint, mostly because Karl-Anthony Towns will be healthy or starting the year healthy, and knock on wood will stay healthy. And also Naz Reid is in the picture. And we talked about this a little bit in the past, but Naz has a big contract. He started last year on the fringe of the rotation, racked up a few DNP CDs. Naz did in October, early November. Cat gets hurt right around Thanksgiving, and Naz becomes his mainstay in the rotation and never lets go of his spot and is a rotation guy the rest of the year, gets the big extension, the 3-year extension in the offseason. He's now a part of this rotation, which bumps Kyle Anderson to the 3. within the Wolves rotation instead of the 4. That means the defensive matchups will be trickier for Kyle Anderson. He probably will have the ball in his hands a little bit less, especially with the additions of Shake Milton, the re-addition of Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Now, there were moments last year where Kyle Anderson had to run this offense, and he was their only hope against zone defenses. Remember the whole first half, 3/4 of last season, the Wolves could not get out of their own way when teams would switch to zone defense. And of course, zone is never a super it's not a long-term answer within any individual game at the NBA level, but teams would go to it frequently against the Wolves, and they couldn't figure it out unless Kyle Anderson was on the floor, and that he was at least the guy at the nail, at the free throw line, distributing, hitting cutters, understanding where to find the open shooters within the scheme. He's still going to have to play that role, right? He's still going to have to play point forward at times. I just think he'll have the ball in his hands a little bit less this season because the team is deeper, the personnel's better, and hopefully this team is healthy. To back up my point about him having the ball in his hands more last year, yeah, his usage rate was his lowest in 3 seasons. It was the highest assist rate he'd ever had in his career. And that was simply because he was being asked to initiate the second unit because of Jalen Noel's struggles, because of the injury to Jordan McLaughlin, because of the lack of other playmakers. But I think that comes down a little bit. I think that it's fair to assume his 3-point percentage will come down a little bit. I mean, what did he shoot from the corners last year? I have it here somewhere. Again, overall, career high 41%. He shot 46.8% on corner threes last season, and nearly half of his 3-point attempts were from the corners. Now, for his career, actually a little more than half his 3-point attempts are coming from the corners. He's not shooting above the break threes, nor should he be. And it felt like maybe once every couple of games, he'd be wide open and he'd have to shoot it. And that percentage was much lower, but 47% from the corners, he'll get another 1 or 2 of those a game. But I don't think he's going to be as involved in the offense otherwise. They just need him to be a glue guy defensively. Hope he doesn't get isolated too much on quicker wings and guards at the point of attack defensively. He's a really good team defender. You just got to be careful with how often he's on an island on the perimeter. I want to talk a little bit more about the impact of him moving to the 3 and what that does to the team overall, because there are some pros to it too. So we'll do that here next. All right, talking Kyle Anderson to close the show. I want to be clear. Kyle Anderson, I talked about regression, and I started kind of negative with Slow-Mo. Yes, the career highs last year, they're not a bad thing, right? It just means we need to look out for that regression this year. He was invaluable to the Wolves' success. I mean, the Wolves don't win 42 games and frankly, don't get the 7 seed or get into the playoffs and get into the play-in and get the 7 seed in the playoffs without Kyle Anderson. I mean, I don't know. He was probably the most consistent player all season. Obviously, Ant is considered the Wolves' best player. You could argue Kyle Anderson's impact was every bit as good, or if not greater, because he was that glue guy. When Cat was on the floor, yeah, he was good. He wasn't himself, and he also only played 29 regular season games. Mike Conley was something of a savior after the trade deadline, helping this team to further gel and be an adult in the room type of a thing. He only played 24 regular season games in a Wolves uniform. Rudy Gobert was good, but he wasn't his typical self. Kyle Anderson was the constant. And yeah, he missed, what did he miss? 13 games due to injury himself. That's pretty par for the course for Kyle Anderson. I mean, he hasn't played 70 games in a season since 2018, like his entire Memphis career. The most games he played in a season was 69. He's played exactly 69 games each of the last 3 seasons. We can expect that again this year, right? There's going to be back spasms. There's going to be nicks and bruises, and they got to keep him healthy over the course of the season. We could factor all that in. He was still really impactful last season, and the Wolves, frankly, do not win 42 games, do not have the palatable finish to the season that they did. Not super exciting, but winning the play-in, winning a game against Denver, great. That doesn't happen without Kyle Anderson. Now, in terms of him playing the 3, it's not ideal from a defensive perspective. It probably doesn't matter that much from the offensive side of things because his role will basically be the same on offense. It will, I think. I mean, it should help them on the glass. Now, Kyle Anderson had, I believe, a career worst year rebounding the basketball. Yeah. This is actually kind of crazy. Over the course of his first 7 seasons in the league, Kyle Anderson had a rebound rate of between 11.0 and 11.5% every single year, which is insane. You can go through a Basketball Reference, every single player. Nobody, I don't know this for a fact, but I know this for a fact. No other players had within a half percentage point, exact same total rebound rate for 7 straight years. That's exactly what happened to Kyle Anderson, an 11% rebound rate between 11 and 11.5 every single year. Last season, or 2 years ago with Memphis, it jumped to 13% because he played more center. Memphis played a lot of small ball. Jaren Jackson Jr. was hurt a bunch. He played some center, and his rebound rate went up. Last year, a career low 10.5% rebound rate. His total rebound rate, his defensive rebound rate was under 17%, which was easily a career low. He'd only had 2 other seasons below 18% at any point in his career. And that's now a 9-season career. Part of that was getting pulled away from the basket with defensive assignments. That should happen less this year. Just because they have more defenders, Nikhil Alexander-Walker, and hopefully more Jaden McDaniels, less foul trouble. But in theory, it's an advantage for the Wolves because they get a bigger lineup on the floor. They put Slow-Mo at the 3. But in general, if you look at the course of his career, the advanced stats tell a story that when he's at the 3, he's less effective than when he's at the 4. Now, part of that could be less rebounding because he's near the basket less as a 3. But I also think it's because he has had in the past a tendency to be overexposed on offense. I think the Wolves did a good job at limiting that last year because he had a career shooting year from 3 and he was effective offensively. I think with the way the Wolves want to play offensively, that's not going to hurt them too much. But I would have caution, assuming that Kyle Anderson is going to turn in another 41% three-point shooting season, another year with an effective field goal percentage north of 55%. That's pretty unlikely to happen this year. I think he can have a similar season, even though he'll be at the 3. I think with the way the Wolves, what Chris Finch wants to do on offense and the way the Wolves are constructed, he can turn in a similar year to last year, even if that 3-point percentage comes down a little bit. I'm comfortable saying that I think he'll have a similar all the way around season. Now, the minutes will be less. Hopefully they should be. They should be able to keep him fresher. He played the most minutes per game last season than he had since 2019. And that was he only played in 43 games. So that was the season since his rookie year, he played the least. So last year was the most minutes he's played. Let's see. The most total minutes he's played in a season since 2017-18, and the second most in his career. And he's 30 this year. Kyle Anderson just turned 30 at the end of September. So they're going to want to limit his minutes on some level anyway. Like hopefully he can play 70 some games, but you don't want him averaging 28 minutes per game. And if things go according to plan, he won't need to. You've got Naz Reid to play the 4. Karl-Anthony Towns will play the 4. You've got Naz to play the center and Kat to play the 4. Kyle Anderson is going to play a lot more 3 this season than what we've seen in previous years. And while it's not ideal, I don't think it's necessarily going to hurt them that much. Everything else about Kyle Anderson has been overwhelmingly positive in a Timberwolves uniform. And from his finishing at the rim, the isolation defense on the perimeter has actually been really good. Playmaking, B-ball index gave him an A last season. Again, career high assist rate. He initiated a lot of offense. I think that also comes down a little, which may lower some of these other metrics that suggest he had a career season last year, just because he'll have the ball in his hands less. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can always go back to that, right? You can always add more slow-mo possessions. He's always essentially your backup to the backup at every role on this team, right? He can be a perimeter defender in isolation, point of attack. He's not your first choice, but he can do it and do an okay job. He can initiate your offense. He's not your first choice. He can do it and do an okay job. He can play the 4 or the 5, or he can play the 3 or the 5, even though he's best cast as a power forward. He's not your first choice, but he can do those roles. He is really a Swiss Army knife, which I think is the way that Chris Finch put it early last season a couple of times in the media, was calling him a Swiss Army knife. He can do a little bit of everything. And last year it was more ball in his hands, initiate offense. This year, hopefully, it's less of that and more of like, hey, we'll just fill him in wherever we need him. All right. That's all we have for you today here on the show. Again, Thursday, we'll talk a little Dallas Mavericks preseason. We'll talk a little bit more player previews. Friday, we'll do the post-game pod after Thursday's preseason game in Abu Dhabi against the Mavs. So a big week upcoming here at Locked On Wolves. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Beecken and at Locked On T-Wolves. Don't forget the T. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.